Good morning.
Good morning.
In 2004, Ashton Kutcher starred in a movie entitled The Butterfly Effect. But before that, Jeff Goldblum in Jurassic Park played Ian Malcolm, a scientist of chaos theory who explained the butterfly effect by dropping water on Ellie's arm and letting it run off. Then he dropped the water again, and it ran in a different direction. Ian explained how the slightest variation at the start, either in her skin or in the water or even just a slight breeze, can cause an entirely different effect. In Exodus chapter 1, verses 15 through 21, Shiphrah and Puah are the two women that we're going to talk about this morning. Shiphrah means beauty or fair, and Puah, most scholars think, might mean something like a little girl. I'm just curious, how many of you have heard of them before? Most people haven't. There's only 6 verses in the entire Bible that talk about them, and yet they are responsible for saving the entire nation of Israel and essentially writing Old Testament history as we know it today. They were midwives. Those are women who helped other women to birth their children. They were probably barren. We don't know that for sure, but that was often the case in ancient societies. It's believed that maybe they got into midwifing because that was a way for them to participate in bringing children into the world, which was something that they could not do for themselves. We're not certain if they were actually Hebrew or if they were simply assigned to serve the Hebrew women. They were probably Hebrew. Their name would suggest that because their names are of Semitic origin. They also probably served both actually the Hebrews and the Egyptian women because unless they were just lying, they were able to give Pharaoh a comparison of how the two different ethnic groups dealt with their birthing experiences, in which they indicated that the Hebrew women were better at it than the Egyptians were. My father-in-law once told me that he was able to give a similar comparison because of some experiences that he had had when he was stationed in Korea while he was in the Air Force. He said they used to hire the locals to clear the fields around the base where he was stationed, and that oftentimes women who were pregnant would still be working out in the fields. And occasionally one would go into labor and would actually give birth to her child there in the field. And then after cleaning it up and strapping it to her back, she would finish clearing the field. I've never heard of that happening in parallel, so I guess the Korean women are better at birthing than we are. But these two women were held in high respect, even before Pharaoh, because they were able to appear before Pharaoh personally. We also know that that was not uncommon, again, in the ancient societies for people who had medical skills. They were held in high respect. But this also might indicate that these two women were chiefs, or that they were officers of some sense, perhaps over the entire midwife crew that would serve the women that were giving birth. And this is probable because their actions, we're told, saves the entire nation, not just the few babies that they could have personally attended. And there's no way that they could have been midwives to the entire populace of the Israelites at that time. Some have suggested that they may have personally birthed Moses, because Moses is the one who wrote Exodus, and that would explain then why we know their names. But they were ordered by Pharaoh, who was the king of Egypt at the time, to kill any Hebrew male infants at birth, but they could let the females live. Now this was done because Israel was becoming too many and too powerful for the Egyptians to control. And that scared them. They were afraid about the men especially, that they might grow strong enough that they would stage a revolt, or if Egypt went to war, that they might side with their enemies and fight against them. Pharaoh tried to control them first of all by imposing harsh slavery on them, and when that didn't work, then he came up with this birth control policy. But Shiphrah and Puah refused to obey Pharaoh. The text tells us they did it because they feared God. That means either they revered him as God, or possibly that they simply feared his retaliation if they crossed him. Solomon, I think, indicates that both of those attitudes are smart ones to have. It's remarkable, though, that they would disobey Pharaoh, because Pharaoh was the most important and powerful person in the world at that time. Relatively speaking, Pharaoh in his day would have been even more powerful than Obama. He'd been more powerful than Art Smith, and more powerful even than Oprah. When Pharaoh called them in and interrogated them about why they had not followed through with his order, that's when they explained that the Hebrew women were more vigorous than the Egyptians and gave birth before they could get there. This was probably just an excuse and may have actually been an outright lie, because the text also tells us that they let the male children live, meaning that they had the opportunity apparently to kill them, but they deliberately did not. The text also tells us that God dealt well with them because of this. That is to say, literally, he did good to them. In verse 21 in particular, it says that he gave them families. Some think that the them in that statement, he gave them families, actually refers to Israel, meaning that God gave additional families to Israel, and therefore they multiplied and grew strong because of what Shiphrah and Puah had done. But most commentators and scholars, from what I've been able to determine, think that this actually refers to Shiphrah and Puah, that he gave them households or families of their own. And that's significant if we're correct in assuming that up until this time they were probably barren women. The point, I think, is that because of them, Israel continued to multiply and grew very strong, and the rest of the Old Testament history developed the way that we know it today. You see, if they had acted differently, what would have changed? Would anything have changed? I believe that Jesus would still have entered the world. I think that was God's purpose from the very beginning, and I don't believe that God's purposes can fail or anything can defeat them. So I have no doubt that Jesus still would have come and done what he did. But it might have happened through a whole different series of events, one in which there was no Moses or Samuel or David or Solomon. Instead, today we might be reading in our Old Testaments about Mupim or Salu or Dodavah or Shoah. These are all real people, by the way, but they're not the characters or the heroes of the Old Testament that we know and love. Paul says in Romans chapter 15 and verse 4 that the Old Testament was written for our instruction. I think that means when we read it, we ought to ask ourselves, what is it teaching me? And some have seen in this text that it is the first recorded act of civil disobedience in history, and believe it is therefore teaching us that God approves of civil disobedience. There are actually many places in the Bible where civil disobedience was right and it was warranted. You're probably familiar with the story in Acts chapter 5 where Peter and John are standing before the Jewish courts, and they're being ordered not to preach anymore about Jesus. And Peter says, you decide for yourself if you think it's right for us to obey men rather than God, but they were going to continue to preach. The entire book of Revelation is really written as a call to Christians to be faithful to God in spite of the authorities that will kill them if they do. And there are many other places in the Bible where civil disobedience was right. But there are also many places in the Bible where it's clear that God wants us to give Caesar his due and where he wants us to submit to every authority. When I was thinking about this, I couldn't help but think of the movie National Treasure in this one scene where Benjamin Gates suggests that sometimes we have to do what is legally wrong in order to do what is morally right. I actually think that's true. But I also believe that every person has to decide for themselves when that time comes, like Shiphrah and Puah did. But I don't think that that's really what we're supposed to learn from them. In rabbinical writings, the rabbis have tried to make these two women more important by associating them with characters that we think are important. There are many rabbis who have suggested that Shiphrah and Puah are actually descriptions of the jobs that they did, and the real characters are Jochebed and Miriam. That would be Moses' mother and his sister. I'm fascinated by this. It seems to me that this attempt to identify them as important characters shows just how difficult it is for us to believe that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. I think that that might actually hit at the real point of what we ought to take away from this. See, we're used to our Bible heroes being heroes, not ordinary people. Bible heroes kill giants. They take on kings. They perform miracles. They have visions of God. But usually a hero is just an ordinary person who happens to do the right thing when no one else can or no one else will. I think most people then fail to be heroes simply because they fail to understand the power of an ordinary person simply doing what is right. We think the deed has to be big or it has to be important in some way in order for it to matter or to make a difference. And yet Jesus clearly taught us that God won't trust us with anything big or anything extraordinary until we first prove that we can do what's right with what we have. So I think that what we're supposed to learn from Shiphrah and Puah is simply that there are no minor characters in God's story. Or I might ought to say there's no minor characters in God's history. Every deed that every person does, every day that we live, changes the course of history forever. Either for the better or for the worse. The butterfly effect is real. Tomorrow will be different from what it would have been because of something that either you have already done or something that you will do before the day is over. In the 10 minutes or so that I have been talking to you this morning, I have already changed the future. Because someone here will now act differently, either better or worse, because of something I've said this morning. That's the power of free will. I think that's the power of simply being human. But will I change it for the better? Or will I change it for the worse? That's the power of doing or not doing what you know is right.